Hello, I'm Tammy Saltzman. Welcome to Divorce Connection Network. Today, I'm so pleased to have Andrea Jacobs. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. I'm so pleased to have you here. Today, I'm Andrea. Let me tell you a little bit about Andrea. Andrea's been practicing almost 25 years here in South Florida. She went to undergrad at the University of Miami, and she went to law school at Gatorville. So she is really a Florida girl. She works, her practice is in Coral Springs, and her partner is Nancy Brodsky, who talked to us about same-sex marriage. So today, Andrea is here. Andrea practices immigration law and bankruptcy. But today we're going to focus on the immigration aspect of marriage and divorce and the three things that you should think about if you are married to someone or thinking about getting married to someone who is in need or getting a green card. So, Andrea, how are you today?
I'm fine.
Good. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about what they should be considering if they are thinking about getting married or divorced, and immigration issues are part of the calculation.
Yes. Well, if you are thinking about getting married to someone who is not an American, one thing you have to consider as the American spouse, you would be the sponsor for that person's immigration, and you would have to sign something called an affidavit of support. An affidavit of support makes you legally liable for that person's support for a 10-year period of time or until that person becomes a citizen, which through a marriage case could be about 6 years. Could be anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on circumstances. So you could be liable for up to 10 years, but definitely a minimum of 4 years. For affidavit of support purposes, basically what that means is if you get divorced and the person applies for any public benefit, such as food stamps or welfare, and the government ends up paying out money for that person, the government can go back to you and look to you to reimburse their expenses.
So when you say they can go back to you, does that mean that there are some cases that they don't go back?
I have to tell you honestly, in the affidavit of support, this version has been around since about 2004. I have never had a case where the government's gone back to an American spouse to look to recover monies that the non-American might have.
But they can if they so desire.
Yes.
And so what if that person does something criminally and causes a huge liability? I would think that the government would come back after you as well. Does the support affidavit, does it have anything to do with
a criminal thing? No.
No?
No. If the alien spouse commits some kind of a crime, that's totally on the alien spouse. They cannot look to the American spouse to recover any portion of any debt that might be owed as a result of the crime.
Okay, now, in a divorce case, say you're only married 2 years, you realize that your spouse is not really marrying you because they love you, but they just want their green card, and now you want to get divorced, and you don't want, in the real world, you probably wouldn't be liable to pay alimony to someone you were only married to for 1 or 2 years with no children. But in an immigration case, if the spouse hires another lawyer, wouldn't that lawyer then advocate that they would be responsible financially for that person for the 10 years that they promised the government? Do you ever see that situation happen?
We haven't really come in contact with that situation. I believe that definitely that could be an issue. It's definitely a double-edged sword if you sponsor somebody and then you later get divorced, especially in the first 2-year period of time. If you marry someone who's not an American and you're married less than 2 years and you sponsor the person for residency or a green card, then that person only gets a 2-year green card. It's called a conditional green card. 90 days prior to the 2-year period, both of you have to petition immigration to get the conditions removed. So if there's a divorce that happens in that 2-year period of time, there's a lot of issues at stake. One, that person might not get permanent residency beyond the 2 years. Two, is there any type of legal liability for the American spouse on the affidavit of support? Well, if they don't continue on the sponsorship to remove the conditions and they're divorced ahead of time, then that's when their sponsorship ends and their affidavit of support obligation ends. So if they hire a divorce attorney on the immigrant side and they're looking for alimony and it's typically not provided, but they do argue the affidavit of support, then the American side of it would be, well, we're not going to sign to have the person's conditions removed, and the obligation would end there.
Okay, very interesting. What's the next tip that you want to tell our audience about?
Well, a couple things that I wrote down. One thing would definitely be, remember, if the marriage was not valid at the outset, then you're talking about marriage fraud, and that's a huge liability for both spouses. Marriage fraud, there's an imprisonment of up to 5 years and a $250,000 fine.
Wow.
If you've ever committed marriage fraud, then you're no longer able to sponsor someone in the future. So, something like that. I always tell our immigration clients when they come in for a marriage case that they should look about getting a prenup ahead of time, because that's something to protect the American spouse, definitely, or even the alien if they had money prior to marriage or assets, and it also gives immigration the feeling that this really is a bona fide marriage if there's a prenuptial agreement.
Oh, that's interesting to know. So the government views prenuptial agreements in immigration cases as a source of validity that the marriage is real.
Correct.
Wow, that's great to know. So, most family lawyers do prenuptial agreements. Do you do any of that, or you refer that stuff to Nancy?
I refer it either to Nancy or outside of our practice, because we have to remember, if we're handling an immigration marriage case, we represent both parties, the American and the immigrant.
Oh, right.
So we don't want to have any conflict of interest. Sometimes we have them sign waivers, but, in order to protect ourselves, we usually have an outside attorney do it.
So marriage fraud would be just marrying someone for the green card and pretending that you love each other, and it's really not the case.
Right.
And there are times, I think, that people offer money. Please marry me and I'll pay you.
Yes.
And so that would all be considered fraud. Now, when you fill out the application, the government would investigate, I would imagine, and
there's certain flags. The first thing we do with anybody that calls for an immigration marriage case is we have them come into the office, both parties, to sit down for the initial consultation, because we want to make sure that we're handling a valid case from the outset. So there are certain things. I pretend I'm an immigration officer and I'm going through a checklist, making sure that these people pass my criteria before we file any application with immigration.
That's interesting. And I know I'm going off a little bit, but how many do you see immigration couples coming in once the green card is issued that now they want a divorce? We've seen it several times in 25 years. I'd like to say that we don't see it that often in our practice, because I sit there and I grill them to make sure that this isn't the case. But just like with any marriage with two U.S. citizens, you could get married and find out 5 months later that the whole thing's been a sham or a fraud. One party's not really upfront with the other party, and there you go. People get divorced for a variety of reasons, right? Yes, and they get married for a variety of reasons. I got married at 38 years old and my clock was ticking. So, I really wanted to have a family. And so, that was really what was leading me, to finally at 38 to settle down. And so we all have our reasons. What is your last tip for our audience regarding immigration? Well, I think with any immigration marriage case, you have to make sure that you take a case that the people really know each other. They're both of their financial interests have been protected, and that they understand that it's not going to be a 6-month marriage. They're in it for at least 3 to 4 years, and this is something that you don't take lightly, especially when you're going to sign all these documents that are going through a government agency. I think it's really important that people think very carefully before committing, these affidavits. They're sworn affidavits. They're usually notarized. Isn't that correct? Yes. And so you can't go back and say, well, I didn't know. The government is going to want you to have integrity. We just were talking with an attorney about credibility and how important credibility is. And if you do commit fraud, that's going to stay with you forever.
Right.
You know, it's a crime. So, Andrea, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, really. You will be able to go onto Divorce Network, ConnectionNetwork.com to find Andrea's contact information and a link to her website. Thanks for watching.